Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the 78th Annual Conference on World Affairs. My name is Benjamin Teitelbaum. I'm an Associate Professor of Musicology and International Affairs here at CU Boulder. I'm also the Faculty Director of the Conference of World Affairs, and I'll be serving as your moderator today. For recording purposes, this is just to confirm today's date is April 14th, 2026. The panel time is 11 a.m. and our title is Constitutional Crisis, the Presidency and the Rule of Law. Now, before I get started, I would like to read the University of Colorado Boulder's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homeland of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. And we do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Thank you once again, and welcome to CWA and today's discussion. We ask that all our attendees remain respectful throughout this discussion and refrain from interruptions, signs, banners, noisemakers, and other audible disruptions that are not permitted and will result in those responsible being asked to leave the room. Time will be allotted for questions from our in-person audience. We will take questions via handwritten note cards. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and a producer will give you a note card and a pencil. Please print legibly, then raise your hand when you have completed a card, and a producer will collect it and bring it to me. I would add as well, if you are a student, please indicate that in clear language at the top of your note card. Can I ask those in the room, by the way, who will be collecting note cards to please raise their hands? You'll see them in the back. They'll be moving around during this session. And now I would like to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. And you can certainly see their full CWA bios on our CWA website. I will start at the end of the table with Lisa Graves, please.
Thank you so much, Benjamin, and it is such an honor to be back here at CWA and to see such an amazing crowd. My name is Lisa Graves, and I am the co-founder of Court Accountability with my work partner, Alex Aronson. We work on court reform. I lead True North Research, which is a research watchdog group. I'm also part of the Midas Touch Network, Legal AF, and we've got a new show launching May 4th. I have a Substack called Grave Injustice. I have a new book out, Without Precedent. It's now out on audio too, and I am the former Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Policy at the U.S. Department of Justice. I was formerly the Deputy Chief of the Article III Judges Division at the U.S. Courts, the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts, where I helped oversee the Financial Disclosure Office and ethics issues for judges. I also was the Chief Counsel for nominations for the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee for Senator Patrick Leahy. I was also the senior legislative strategist for the ACLU in efforts to reform the Patriot Act, and I previously led, and I'm now the co-chair of the Center for Media and Democracy, which launched ALEC Exposed, a number of projects around Coke and other issues. And when I was on the Senate Judiciary Committee, I had the chance to work with Joshua Levy, and I'm going to pass the baton to him.
Good morning. It's a true pleasure to be here, and I wanted to first just thank my good friend Ingrid Walsh for inviting me here, and to thank her and everybody else who's helped to make this conference possible. Whatever you think you may learn, I've learned 100 times more just talking to everybody here. Very grateful to be here. I'm a lawyer. I practice law in Washington, D.C. I have a law firm called Levy Firestone Muse. For over 25 years, I've represented clients under investigation by every aspect of our government, and I have also helped our firm represent clients conducting investigations. I'm probably the only lawyer who's represented both Hunter Biden and Charlie Kirk. Our clients are across the ideological spectrum. Our law firm has an office in Kigali, Rwanda. We have been investigating the genocide against the Tutsi on behalf of the Rwandan Ministry of Justice for the last 10 years, and that has been an education of a lifetime for me. I am an adjunct faculty member at the Georgetown University Law Center, where I, along with my co-professors, teach 2 courses, one in congressional investigations, the other in healthcare fraud and abuse. And it is just wonderful to be here with all of you.
Good morning. I too want to thank the organizers of the event and for inviting me to come and for putting together such an interesting and dynamic program. My name is Lorraine Voles. I most recently served as Vice President Kamala Harris's Chief of Staff. Thank you. I've spent most of my career in politics, government, and campaigns. It was actually my second tour of duty at the White House. I also worked for Vice President Gore. You can clap again. Equal opportunity there. Worked for 2 senators in Washington, D.C. Did a little sidetrack into university life. I would never say academia when it comes to my skills, but at the George Washington University as the Vice President for External Relations. So I'm really happy to be here and look forward to the discussion.
Good morning. It is very nice to be back in Boulder, Colorado. My name is Patrick Deneen, and last year I was the visiting professor in conservative thought. I know that sounds like an oxymoron or contradiction here at CU. It was really a joyful year for my wife and I to be in this place, in this beautiful part of the country. And already I've seen some very good friends and some students that I had the privilege of teaching during my year here. Having heard the brief resumes of my colleagues here on the panel, as usual in my life, I think mistakes were made. I don't know why I'm on this panel. Other than to prove perhaps the professor of conservative thought has nothing to contribute to such a conversation. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a presidential advisor. I'm a mere college professor. My area of expertise is political philosophy, so if the topic turns to Plato, Aristotle, Alexis de Tocqueville, I will have a lot to contribute. And otherwise, I'm very much looking forward to learning something from people who actually know something, so thank you.
Constitutional Crisis, the Presidency and the Rule of Law. That title itself is gravid with meaning, connotations, suppositions, questions, paradoxes perhaps. And it's not a mystery what is being referred to with it. It is a piece of commentary on the Trump administration. And there is something, I mentioned the word paradox, there is something paradoxical about the Trump administration and its relationship to law. On the one hand, many of the critics of this administration would argue that both in its domestic and in its international interventions, since the start of the second administration in particular, an absence of law or lawlessness seems to be the modus operandi. On the other hand, one of the great promises and the great appeals to voters and to its constituents in populist movements has been a restoration of law and order, rule and order. Those are some of the key phrases that you will see repeated in populist movements across Europe and across the Americas. But I'd like to turn things back to our panelists now and ask for something of a brief opening statement on this question, on the relationship of this presidency, to law. We can take this in reverse order, and I must mention my colleague to my left is very, very humble, Professor Deneen. Yes, he's just a mere professor. Others would say that he actually commands over an entire conversation surrounding liberalism, its future, and if there is such a thing as post-liberalism. So with that as an invitation to please, don't be so bashful and humble. Patrick, if you would start us off with a comment on Trump and his relationship to law.
I'm actually going to decline the invitation to speak specifically on Trump, other than to note that whatever may be said about Trump and the role of the executive and his particular exercise of executive powers, I regard as not a radical departure from what we have seen in American politics over roughly, certainly the last 50 years, and a development that is at least 100 years old. So I want to put the current moment in a bit of context. This is my effort to bring Plato and Aristotle into the conversation. It seems to me there are three structural reasons why we all in this room, no matter what our political affiliation is, no matter what we think of this specific president or previous presidents, but structural reasons why we all ought to be concerned about the role and rise of executive power in American politics. And I'll just mention the following, that the people who have been consistently sounding the alarm about the centralization of power in America, and particularly its centralization in the executive, have tended to be conservatives. They've been particularly anxious over the concentration of power in Washington. I'm not claiming that they've done a lot about to redress it, but they certainly have engaged in a lot of hue and cry over that issue. The first of these structural reasons is the rise of the administrative state, which is a legacy of the progressive era going back to the turn of the century. There are both philosophic as well as, of course, practical reasons why we saw the rise of the administrative state. Some of these simply a nation that was growing, an economy that was becoming more integrated, the rise of massive economic powers and the railroads and the trusts, the need increasingly to regulate a vast number of parts of American economic and social and political order that required that centralization. But this was also a reflection of a philosophical view that politics should no longer be left to the amateurs. It should be rather left to the experts. And hence you had the argument of figures in the progressive era of the need for an administrative class who were selected on the basis of their expertise and no longer simply having been appointed by a political figure. And so the rise of the administrative state, in which you go from really a very small number of federal workers, roughly in the hundreds of thousands, up until the New Deal, and almost 80 to 90% of these were postal workers. This was most of the federal workforce were people who worked for post offices. To the New Deal, where that rises to close to 1 million, to post-World War II until today, where that number rises to 2.5 to 3 million. Well, all that 2.5 to 3 million people have one boss, and that boss is the president. And the president, whether personally or simply through intermediaries, is now running a vast enterprise, larger than any corporation, larger than any organization, maybe other than the Catholic Church. I mean, it's just an absolutely massive organization, and thus has led to, among other things, not only the centralization of power, but much more of the exercise of the power at the level of sort of the discretion of individuals in that administrative state. And so questions of rule of law that I think are going to be raised are implicated, of course, always by the expansion of discretion in the administrative state and the question of whether or not those follow the rule of law or not. The second structural reason would be something that President Eisenhower warned us about, which is the rise of the military-industrial complex, and of course the expansion of what we would broadly call the American empire today. Of course, we're all familiar with aspects of that empire, but it is not a particularly partisan matter. The expansion of American global footprint, certainly since the end of World War II, has meant that much more of simply the exercise of foreign policy, which of course implicates our domestic politics, runs now through one office, through the executive. And I think there would be broadly bipartisan agreement that the fact that there has been no official congressional declaration of war since 1942, and a time in which we have engaged in a lot of wars, is a cause for concern in a nation that at least still calls itself a republic. And here I think this is one of the structural reasons why I think this goes beyond any concerns we may have about the current administration. And lastly, associated with these two, we have seen fundamentally, I think the constitutional crisis is not necessarily the executive, although these are reasons why the executive now plays this outsized role. The crisis is really the betrayal of the constitutional design, which is that this was to be a legislatively central, or I should say, legislatively run republic, that the people's voice, the people's will was to be expressed through the legislature. This is why the Capitol is on a hill. It's at the highest point, or among the highest points in Washington, D.C., certainly on the Mall. The legislature was supposed to be supreme and was supposed to pass the legislation that reflected the will of the people. And Congress now has, of course, we can blame Congress for having abdicated that role. Part of the reason for that are the reasons I just suggested. The rise of the administrative state, the rise of the military-industrial complex has made it difficult to legislate, given how much discretion now exists. But it's also the case that there are massive incentives now in Congress not to legislate. No congressperson wants to have a legislative record that they have to run on anymore. It's much more preferable not to have a record, to take stances, to take positions, to have votes on legislation that will never pass, simply as a kind of form of pleasing the constituency. But Congress is not legislating, and so in many ways we could say if there is a crisis of the constitutional order, we might blame Congress, but who puts Congress into office? And here I would say the crisis goes right down into this room, into every seat in this room. I'm not saying you personally, but the citizenry of the United States have not held our elected officials responsible for their lack of legislating. And until Congress resumes its constitutionally mandated role, this crisis of the Constitution will continue and I fear get worse.
Well, I agree wholeheartedly with Patrick's take on the legislative situation. I see it as a capitulation of duty, that the Congress, I don't agree with, I think that it's still important for Congress and some Congress people to pass legislation. I still think there are those who are there. But the capitulation in terms of holding the executive branch to account has been shocking to me. Now, I would add one other thing about the executive branch that I think our current president has really tapped into. It's also part of our culture. We are now, we are a culture of personality. And it's very easy, or so much easier, to focus on the president than it is to 100 senators or 400 plus House members. So I think that kind of dynamic in our culture is affecting our politics. And I do agree that we all have a responsibility here. You know, it's government by the people, for the people. And by the people has been a little lackadaisical lately. I was telling someone earlier this morning I was always so excited, both at the White House and on the campaign, for all the young people who were working so hard and really into the work and wanting to be part of the process. We keep hearing the process is broken, but they wanted to be part of that process. So I think that was always a very encouraging sign to me. So I'll just leave it at that and let Josh clean it all up.
The good professor's focus on the rise of the administrative state is very well taken, and when we're thinking about constraints on presidential power and the branch of government that interprets the law ultimately, the judiciary branch, in its current form, the Roberts Court has restrained executive power in the lane that the professor talked about, in the Loper-Bright decision, in the learning services decisions, where the court said that the executive branch no longer can loosely interpret statutes to regulate, but must instead hew very closely to the words of Congress. It shrinks the executive branch's power to regulate. The same court has also shrunk the power of Congress to regulate. It has shrunk the Commerce Clause power. It has shrunk the president's power to levy tariffs without congressional authorization. So there are constraints emerging on executive power as the executive branch headed by the President of the United States. On the other hand, this very same court has given free license to the president himself not to follow the law. And that is the Trump versus United States decision that came down before President Trump was president. And Chief Justice Roberts, writing for the majority, found that the President of the United States is immune from criminal prosecution for official acts that he or she undertakes that are within the core sphere of his presidential or her presidential powers. Does leave room for some prosecutions of presidents for unofficial conduct and even some official conduct. But I commend to all of you, as Americans and other citizens of the world, to read every word of Trump versus United States. The concurring decisions, the dissenting decisions, particularly the students out there. It's a mess. It's a total mess. Prosecuting a president from here on out is a total mess. And if you look at the majority decision in that case, Chief Justice Roberts is emphasizing the energy and vigor of the President of the United States and how he, Chief Justice Roberts, and the majority of the court do not want the fear of a criminal prosecution to interfere with the President's energy and vigor. That does not keep me up at night about this President. He has plenty of energy and vigor. The difference between the majority and the dissent in large respects is the majority is fearful of the good faith acts of prosecutors. As a criminal defense attorney, I have a lot of empathy with that perspective. And I will get into that in a second. The dissent is very concerned about an unbounded president who does not care about following the law. There is nothing in the text of the Constitution that provides for presidential immunity. Nothing. The majority went to texts, Federalist Papers, others, and found energy and vigor. The dissent looked at Federalist Paper number 70, where Alexander Hamilton talks specifically about his assurance that the president would be vulnerable to prosecution, knowing that the safety of the republic was going to be a key objective and duty of the President of the United States. So where does that leave us? It leaves us where the founders were in the first place. They thought George Washington was going to be president. They were right for the first 8 years. It wasn't always thus. The President of the United States has to take responsibility himself, herself. That person needs to understand the value of the rule of law, the take care clause of the Constitution, which is there to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And we as voters need to do a better job of selecting individuals to lead our country.
We are in a constitutional crisis, and we've been in a severe constitutional crisis since that decision by the Roberts Court in Trump versus United States, creating unprecedented immunity from criminal prosecution for Donald Trump retroactively, basically pardoning him at the time, a judicial pardon, and then paving the way for his return to power by issuing that decision just months before the presidential election in 2024, signaling to some people in the country that President Trump did no wrong and in essence could do no wrong in anything that is considered a so-called official act. John Roberts and the Roberts Court have bookended that destructive decision with 24 emergency orders paving the way for Donald Trump to engage in an array of actions that lower court judges have found across the board, regardless of whether they were appointed by Reagan, the first Bush, Clinton, the second Bush, Obama, Biden, and even some Trump judges in the first term, that Donald Trump's actions created irreparable harm for individuals across the country in a number of areas, and that those individuals had a substantial likelihood of success on the merits. And those courts issued temporary restraining orders that were based on evidence in court, testimony under oath about those harms, along with legal arguments about the ways these many actions by Donald Trump violated longstanding constitutional provisions, statutory rights, regulations, rules, and contracts. And in those statutes include the budget, where Congress specifically budgeted funds for an array of agencies, including USAID, the Department of Education, the Department of Health, an array of actions that this president took in defiance of those laws. And this court, which could have just let those temporary restraining orders stand in place until those cases were resolved and then properly appealed to the Supreme Court, aggressively intervened and ruled in favor of Donald Trump, accelerating this crisis that we're in. So, how did we get here? We have a Roberts Court, a court at the top of our judicial system that is engaging in actions that are very partisan, I would say hyper-partisan, without so-called judicial humility, without the modesty that John Roberts attested to when he was nominated to the role of Chief Justice of the United States, in which he pledged to you and to Congress that no one was above the law. No one is above the law was the headline that came out of those confirmation hearings in 2005, and that was because we were facing a different presidential situation in terms of revelations of torture. We had an AUMF, an authorization for the use of military force, that had been, in essence, interpreted as license to rip away our obligations to the Geneva Conventions, which the United States helped create. But John Roberts attested that he understood that one of the core principles of American democracy is that no one is above the law. Just as Joshua reiterated from the Federalist Papers and more, there is no provision in this Constitution. You could read it every day, all day, and find no provision for immunity for the president. There is one provision of immunity. It's for members of Congress on the floor, that they cannot be held for libel for things they say on the floor. You may disagree with that approach, but the founders and the framers knew how to create immunity if they wanted to, and they did not for the president. And instead, in Article 2 of the Constitution commands that the president has a duty to faithfully execute the law. Twice it says that. Nothing could be more faithless than violating the law and violating it criminally. What John Roberts did in that decision, and I join Joshua in urging you all to read it and read it again, was that he concocted immunity for a president, any president, and this president in particular. He suggested in that opinion, and I really want to call it an opinion that will ultimately be rebuked, it's already reviled, and it's going to have to be repealed. I, for example, support the No Kings Act as one method for doing so, along with court reform. But the fact is, in that opinion, John Roberts claims that any official act of the president is beyond the reach of the criminal law. And remember, what the court had before it was an indictment of Donald Trump for his acts trying to subvert our election on January 6th, along with his efforts with his co-conspirators to get fake electors appointed in other states, including in Arizona and Wisconsin. And John Roberts said that no, presidents can direct the Justice Department. They have the power to direct the Justice Department, which is a direct line to where we are in these raids on the ballots in Fulton County and more. Unprecedented actions by a president to try to serve his own agenda by using the law enforcement of this United States in order to pursue his enemies and to try to make fiction into fact. Now, Joshua and I may probably agree on this point, which is that there remains a dispute about what would be an official act if you're doing it for your campaign or not. That remains an issue where I think the arguments certainly are if you're doing it as a candidate, it should not count as an official act. But I would go further than that, which is to say the official acts doctrine that John Roberts invented is deeply dangerous, and it's dangerous to every one of us. In that opinion, John Roberts asserted that the pardon power is one of those official acts of the president that is beyond review by the courts or by Congress. So we now have a spate of pardons by this president of his co-conspirators, in essence, on January 6th, of people who've engaged in deep and destructive fraud to the American people, who've defrauded people and been found guilty of those crimes. He's pardoned people whose family has given money to his campaign. He's pardoned people who have been in business with his sons. These are corrupt acts, in my view, and the Constitution specifically also allows charges for bribery. I think we have a lot of work to do to hold a president accountable who would use those powers in that way. But I will tell you that there are acts proposed in Congress to make it clear that the pardon power is not beyond review, does not allow such corruption to take hold. And in fact, that pardon power as it currently exists, and as Donald Trump articulated it just this past week when he said he would pardon anyone within 200 feet of himself as he left office, if he leaves office, that is fundamentally corrupt. And the danger we face is a president that this court has said can commit crimes within the bounds of official acts, which could include war crimes, acts that we've been seeing perhaps unfold, for example, regarding Venezuela and in Iran, but also domestic crimes. You may remember that J.D. Vance suggested, although he retracted it, that those agents that were involved in killing people in Minnesota were absolutely immune. They are not. But this president believes that he can immunize anyone, and that is an utter disaster for the rule of law. If a president can commit crimes wrapped in the realm of an official act, and then he can pardon the officers who he directs to aid him, we do not have a rule of law left in this country. We are in a deep constitutional crisis, and we must come together to reform this court and to reform these laws. And let me just say this before I conclude, which is to say, I deeply appreciate my panel. I disagree on the diagnosis of the problem being the rise of the administrative state. The administrative state is us. It's the power of we the people to constrain the corporations that were growing without bound during the robber baron era. There was an important effort by progressives to try to make sure that we had health and safety rules in the workplace, to make sure that we didn't have food that was filled with poison, to make sure that we would have progress in our economic situation so that people could retire in dignity. These advances helped make America thrive until they've been systematically dismantled by opponents of this movement. And I would say on the last point, I'm not going to dispute every single thing my fellow panelists said, I promise. But this issue that it's your fault, perhaps, that you haven't elected the right people. Part of the problem is that we have a redistricting process for drawing those maps that this court, the Roberts Court, has intervened in to make it harder for you to hold people accountable by ensuring massively partisan districts so that if they're on your team, if you're a part of that tribe, that person is not held accountable except for through a primary to someone to the right or left of them. We have so few competitive districts left in the country because of this Roberts Court and its usurpation of the power of we the people to decide our maps, and its usurpation of the power of we the people to enact things like the Voting Rights Act to protect the right to vote and have enforcement mechanisms that really work, and by this court's usurpation of the power of Congress to regulate the dark money that has flooded into our elections by these billionaires, empowering and enthroning these billionaires to empower a candidate like Trump. And so we have a crisis that we cannot turn away from, but I come to you with great hope that together we can and will solve this, we will reverse this, and we will not allow this to continue.
Broadly speaking, there were two different accounts of lawlessness, and actually not a lot of a dispute for it, at least in the broadest terms, looking at the power of the executive as it is today as being concerning. But those two accounts, as I think we heard from Lisa's comments there, were in conflict with one another. One of them would say that this is actually the product of structural changes that took place in the country over many, many years that almost seem to, and pardon me if I'm summarizing you incorrectly, Patrick, but that seem to necessitate the growth of a massive state in order to manage an economy of this size and this dynamic, and perhaps also a military state of this size. On the other hand, we could say that all the problems are coming from the actions of perhaps some individuals. Chief Justice Roberts would stand out, was mentioned by name in many cases. So there's a potential point of disagreement here. Is this something that could be solved if the right people were sitting at the same seats of power, or do those seats of power need to be fundamentally transformed? I would like to, with that as a backdrop, start in on some of your questions. This is an unusually philosophical and almost poetic question to receive spontaneously. Quote, "The veil is lifting, revealing a system that has always operated this way to varying degrees. As we see it more clearly, our nation's shared history story about the roles of citizens and leaders is shifting. In the vacuum, paranoia takes hold. What would it look like to stop deconstructing the narrative, but to instead construct a new narrative that balances reality with aspirations for the ideal?" Anyone on the panel, please feel free to jump in.
I'm a philosopher, but I'm not a poet. It's a great and challenging question, and I now have opportunity to talk a little bit about Alexis de Tocqueville. When Alexis de Tocqueville came to America, he was a Frenchman from an aristocratic background. He visited America in 1830, 1831, and then he wrote the first of his 2 volumes entitled De la démocratie en Amérique, of Democracy in America, 1835, volume 2 following in 1840. In 1835, volume 1, that's particularly close to my heart, I grew up in Connecticut, he praises something he thought the world would never see, which was a flourishing democracy. A flourishing democracy that he saw taking place in the townships of New England, in which citizens took the responsibility and saw it as their duty to govern together, to shape their futures together. He said that in the process of governing together, they would come out of that encounter different. They may have come in with a particular set of interests, but they left that encounter, he said, with their hearts enlarged. So that politics wasn't simply a sort of partisan behind the veil, I state what I think, you state what you think, we have an argument, we wave signs, and then we go home satisfied that I've signaled my virtues. It's actually an encounter in which we may end up in a slightly different place than we thought we would. In volume 2, he wrote of his fear that democracy in America would transform into something different. And what it would transform into was a people that became highly interested in commercial pursuits in their individual lives, beginning to separate from each other geographically, psychically. The rise of what he described, the word he invented, individualism, would lead to a decline of democracy in that first sense and lead to a rise of democracy which would be increasingly seen as run by other people somewhere else, and would be especially in a distant place where we as citizens would increasingly feel like we didn't exercise any control over that. And I think no matter what our political orientation, what we think about this administration or the structures in which this administration is a part, one thing I think that we all feel and sense is that there's been a deep sense that we no longer control our destinies together. Whatever it is we might disagree about, that we seem to be voiceless. It's difficult for us to articulate what it is that we the people are able to exercise politically over our structure. Now, part of this, I think, does go back to the structure and the kind of course of America, which is that we have become a very powerful, wealthy, increasingly global nation, which makes it, of course, impossible for us to think we're going to run our lives in the New England townships. But I would say that we need to begin to think not only about the great Hamilton, that guy, that star of the Broadway play, and his vision for a great, powerful, commercially powerful, wealthy, prosperous, militarily powerful nation, but that other great Pole of the founding, Thomas Jefferson, who spoke especially of the strength of democracy arising from our role as citizens and our capacity as citizens to exercise deliberation. So I would simply say to change the paradigm would be in some ways to make sure that even if we love Hamilton, who by the way argued for a king in the Constitutional Convention, so no kings means you might have to be worried a little bit about Hamilton. To remember and to attempt to reenact and to revivify that Jeffersonian tradition of local democracy, that perhaps in this way we can begin to exercise our voices in ways that we can no longer think of Washington, D.C. as out there, as a separate place. Government, I think this is absolutely right what you said, Lisa, that it's we the people. The government isn't something out there, it's us. And I think that would be the paradigm shift we would really need to begin to enact and to live.
And could I just agree with Patrick? I would like to agree with Patrick. I think those are such valuable points in this issue of, you'll see a report in the news, the country is polarized. Well, that polarization is in part because the politicians no longer have to compromise. They don't act as though they have to. In fact, certainly the Republican Party made a brand of treating compromise as a dirty word when it was attacking Clinton and Obama and more. And I do think we need to return to a notion of where is that common ground? Where can we find common ground? But it is very difficult to do so when the people's branch, Congress, has been so neutered both by the court and by its own practices, by the way elections work in this country, and by this hyper-partisan map drawing that this court has set on steroids, and also with the insistence of Donald Trump in this past year, fearing accountability, fearing that there could be a Congress that could hold oversight hearings or perhaps pursue impeachment proceedings against him or members of his cabinet. I think that, to go back to the spirit of the question, this idea of us being voiceless, this feeling that we don't have control over our destiny is, in my view, in my diagnosis, in large part due to judicial supremacy, a court that has inserted itself between us and our members of Congress and their ability to do common sense things, like the McCain-Feingold, bipartisan campaign reform act, which said, if you're gonna spend a bunch of money before an election, you should tell us who's spending. We should know, because you're obviously trying to influence the election, whether you say vote for or against, or you say, call so-and-so and say, don't support this policy. It's about those elections, and we should know who's funding it. The reality right now is that these politicians, they raise money in the open. You can see their campaign finance reports or the reports of the party. And there are still limits that Congress imposed on how much an individual could give to them directly. But now with the advent of super PACs, which is a direct result of the Citizens United decision and a related case called Speech Now versus FEC, we have super PACs that can take unlimited sums from people or groups that you may not know who the group is. Money's transferred in, it's from like a black box, it's a shell game, and we now have most politicians in this country at the federal level are outspent by these outside groups that are not accountable to anyone but themselves. And even though you don't know the billionaires that are funding these C4, 501c4 nonprofit groups that are running all these ads and doing all this work around the election and usually running attack ads to try to take someone down, usually the politicians do know who those funders are. Even if they're not explicitly coordinating, they have like cross-deputized, a former campaign chair is now the head of this C4 group. So the only ones in the dark are us. And that is having a deeply distorting impact on policy. What's on the table, what issues are even debated, is affected and distorted, particularly by this billionaire class, and increasingly now by this sort of the Silicon Valley class of billionaires, some of whom, like Peter Thiel, have expressed out loud their absolute hostility to democracy. These are the last people who should be allowed to spend unlimited funds behind the scenes, whether it's to install someone into a United States Senate seat in Ohio or the White House. Then we have billionaires that are out, like Elon Musk, given powers that they have no confirmation, no Senate confirmation for, an invented job to destroy our agencies and our public wealth and welfare. We have a lot of accounting to do, and I will just say, I also want to agree wholeheartedly with Patrick about the rise of the military-industrial state and the fact that Congress has not asserted its proper role under Article 1 of the Constitution to declare war or not. We cannot have our war policy, just like we cannot have our trade policy, in the hands of one person's whims. It is madness, and we cannot accept this as normal.
So if I may.
Please do.
I actually wanted to comment about something Lisa said earlier in her remarks. The difference now on Capitol Hill compared to, like, let's even say 1990, 1992, there was so much bipartisan work. In the early 2000s, I worked for Senator Clinton. She worked closely on so many pieces of legislation with Senator McCain. They had brainstorms, our staffs worked together, they traveled together, they enjoyed one another's company. And when she started talking about running for president, he indicated to her very clearly, we're done. Just couldn't do it anymore, and they'd always have this relationship, but that was it. There was not going to be any more kind of working together on combined legislation. And when I think about what the Hill was like then and what it's like now, there's just no incentive to work together. The loudest voices are, attacking from either side, and it really has affected. Now, I know that I'm not talking about we the people right now. I mean, I'm talking about that complex in Washington, D.C., which I've been part of for a long time. But it's really changed the dynamics. Every once in a while you see it. There can still be softball games where staffs will play together, or they'll have, a conference that they may work on together, but it's very few and far between. And it used to be, if you were an intern and you got your first job working for a Republican senator, and your second job, you wanted to work for a Democratic senator, that could happen. It can no longer happen. It's really sad.
Ben?
We have many, oh, please, Joshua. Well, turning to Joshua. We have many questions, so I'll ask, we're now in the final 10 minutes of our panel, so I will ask my panelists to please be brief so that we can get through as many of these as possible. But here are two questions from students that I was going to address either to Joshua or to Lorraine. Do you believe that ranked choice voting would enable the electorate to have a better choice instead of picking one of the two that we are seen as bad picks? A second question, how will the gradual politicization of the bureaucracy courts and supposedly independent institutions shape executive power in future administrations? How do we, particularly as students, remain educated without being overwhelmed?
I'm really not qualified to talk about ranked choice voting. I will say that, and this is just to really elaborate a little bit on what my co-panelists were saying just a minute ago. I think we've lost our way with some of these media narratives that we've gotten captured to, chasing Hillary Clinton, chasing President Biden, chasing President Trump, the law drama on Fox, CNN, MSNBC, you name it. It sucks up all the oxygen, and we forget what is important to us beyond whether our president committed a crime or not, which is not a small thing, but it shouldn't be everything. And so what we've had is a slow erosion of focus on what matters. The 2016 election, in my view, you had the two most popular candidates were both socialists, Bernie Sanders and Trump. Trump was a national socialist. And government, for the first time in forever, my living memory, and I'm in my 50s, was a solution for Republicans. The wall. This was a change. It's because the leaders of our country were not meeting us where we are. And it's not to say that we don't play a role. We play a role. And one of the restraints on presidential power is civic society. The first 3 months of this administration were very challenging for millions of Americans, for members of civic society. If you were at a university, if you were at a nonprofit, if you were at a law firm, if you were a lawyer, the zone was being flooded. And then slowly it thawed out. And I'm here to tell you, civic society in America is back. There have been hundreds of lawsuits filed. There have been multiple No Kings protests. You see Congress reflecting that activity, and you see more energy. The country has shifted from survivor mode to creative mode. Much of the country has. And I don't think that's going to stop now. But here's another thing that's really important in my view, and this comes from my work in Rwanda and my work on studying Germany between the wars in school. We need to be active politically and hold that in one hand. And we need to know that the people who disagree with us, on the other hand, are people. We cannot lose our heads. It's the political violence in Weimar Germany, it's the political violence in Rwanda that led to worse things later. It wasn't one person, it was all of us. And so I want everybody to be passionate about what they believe in, but crossing that line into violence is the worst. And that's when the political party that you disagree with, that's when they win.
Some relevant data points that come to mind, and a question here made me think of this. There were opinion surveys of Trump's voters ahead of the 2024 election that showed quite a bit of support for the idea that certain rules or laws needed to be broken in order to implement necessary changes. One could also say, speak to members of the Venezuelan diaspora about the legality of the action against President Maduro. And one sentiment that I heard quite frequently was that, well, what did international law do for us? Did international law solve our problem? No, it didn't. Did breaking the law solve our problem? It did something. That comes to mind with when I'm reading this question as well. Could legal action be taken against the Roberts courts? Or where are the constitutional lawyers speaking out loudly with litigation against Roberts, Trump, and the legislators not adhering to the law? Is there a pathway outside of the law?
I think that's a question for me. There is no litigation currently against the Supreme Court or against John Roberts. There are efforts to reform this court that we're spearheading at courtaccountability.org. And we are also working on a people's empowerment effort to really try to have a comprehensive, bold reform package that will address not just what's gone wrong with this court in terms of, there are a variety of things that have been on the table, like term limits. I have helped behind the scenes support impeachment measures to try to figure out ways to hold them accountable. The term limits piece, I think, should be applied across the board to the courts, all courts, no lifetime appointments. You can be a senior judge forever, but not an active judge. So there are a lot of things that need to happen. The lack of ethics enforcement at the Supreme Court is outlandish. The fact that Thomas has taken more than $4 million worth of gifts from his benefactors, people who befriended him after he got on the bench, is extraordinary. If you want to read more about that, read the Pulitzer Prize-winning series by ProPublica. There's so much we can do, and I'll just say, please contact me if you want to join this movement, join this effort to reform the court, because the fact is, if we do not reform this court, it will continue to dismantle our rights for years to come. And it has already created an extraordinarily dangerous situation as it is, with this combination of the power to commit crimes as official acts and this power to pardon. So there's a lot of work to be done, and the reality is that cynicism or skepticism is our enemy. We have to remember, as Patrick said, as we've said, that this Constitution is about we, the people. It's about us, and what do we want our country to look like? What reforms do we want? And I'll tell you what, because I've been behind the scenes on a lot of the right-wing movement for a period, they are not inhibited in the vision they have for our country for 2024, 2025, 2050. We need to think boldly about what's not working and how we can fix it, and then demand that things change to advance a vision of we the people and have our communities come together around that vision. Yeah.
A follow-up, Patrick?
Yeah, I suppose now I have to play my role of being the controversial speaker. I actually want to respectfully at least submit that the notion that the Supreme Court's decision in the Trump, whether or not Trump can be prosecuted, one can disagree with that, but I don't think it came from merely a partisan position. I think it may be a mess of a decision. We know there are a lot of those. But I do think there was rationale behind it. We might disagree with that rationale, but I think we need to understand it. And I want to say this as someone who doesn't like and objects to the centralization and rise of power in the executive. I've already made that clear. But we are now in a position in which the executive is essentially running a lot of our government, both domestic and foreign policy. And if the president, once the president leaves office, is subject to potentially constant prosecution for any and all decisions that could be interpreted as having been against the rule of law, what we will see is infinite and unceasing lawfare. And we will see, I think, efforts increasingly to hide. I mean, we already see that, to hide decisions, to render decisions more or less invisible to the public, to destroy evidence while in office. Of course, these are always things that one is tempted to do. If we live in a society, and if we are largely in agreement that our political order is one that requires a highly centralized executive, for reasons that have been said and are justified in many ways. We have a very complex economy. We need a regulatory state. We need a large administrative state. And that we want to live in a country that has a very strong military, therefore has a strong military-industrial complex. Then we're going to see exactly what we've gotten. We now have presidents since FDR, this is not new, that run the government through executive orders. Donald Trump is not new. In fact, I can give you the numbers, going all the way back to the 3,726 executive orders that were issued by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which are a lot like, it was 4 terms, but it's a lot larger than the very significant number that Trump has passed thus far, roughly around closing in on 500 over the now 1+ several year terms. But that is not so much larger than those that were passed by Obama, 276, George W. Bush, 291, Clinton, 364 over 2 terms. This is not a partisan matter. We run our government increasingly, because so much of it is run through the executive branch, through these decisions made on the basis of discretion that can be challenged on the basis of rule of law, but which, let's face it, require a certain degree of flexibility. require a certain degree of responding to circumstances. There's a wonderful book I want to recommend to you. It was written by the last conservative at Harvard University. It's about 30 years old. Harvey C. Mansfield, you may have heard his name. He wrote a book many years ago called Taming the Prince, in which he argued that the founding fathers understood the executive was going to be the locus of Machiavellian power, that you needed a figure in government, and I'll quote Hamilton here, you alluded to this already, that can act on the basis of decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch, which means speed, immediacy. You can't deliberate over everything. And this is before there's nuclear bombs and the kind drones, et cetera, and the kind of economy that we have. So how do you tame the prince? How do you tame the Machiavellian prince? You put it within the vessel of the Constitution, but you allow for potentially expansive exercise of those executive powers. Secrecy and dispatch. Those powers have increased as the demands on the executive have themselves increased. That's structural. And therefore, the stretching of those powers has increased. I think the decision of the Roberts Court is a recognition of this fact. What are our recourses? Well, we have a number of those. Some of those might be reforms that we could imagine, but those recourses are difficult. They're impeachment and prosecution and removal. They are potentially the voting the figure out of office in some year's time. But I think one of the things that the founders thought would be the ultimate corrective would be how you would be regarded in history, how history would judge you. And I think this might be one of the most powerful ways that we can and should think about our ultimate ability to exercise a high degree of control. I'm not saying I want to give a pass to any crimes and misdemeanors and so forth, but one seeks the presidency, among other things, to have a place in history for as long as there will be history. And how will one be judged? And I dare say this might be, in some ways, the ultimate form of the exercise of a certain amount of power that we have in terms of how we remember and how we relate the fame or infamy of that particular figure for all time.
Ben, may I just... Please. Patrick, thank you. I do want to round out the factual record a little bit about what this president has done that is a marked departure from previous presidents in terms of the exercise of his power and his lack of fidelity to the rule of law. It is not just the volume of executive orders, it is what they say. It is whom they target. I don't know of a president that has targeted individual American citizens in executive orders and presidential memoranda. I don't know of a president that has targeted private businesses, private law firms, universities by name in executive orders and presidential memoranda. And not for any old reason, but because they employ or did things that he found to be in opposition to himself personally and politically. This president does not rely on the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice, which for decades, and they're not always right about the law, but at least as a matter of practice, there were White Houses before this one that valued that some of these legal questions are very complicated and require a second opinion or a considered opinion. And just that process, that give and take between a White House counsel's office and executive branch agencies, offices of general counsels, and the Office of Legal Counsel to think through these issues because the law matters. It's a value to every other president before this one in that way. The watering down to the inspectors generals who were created after Watergate. The watering down of the Office of Government Ethics, created after Watergate. And it brings me to a bit of a controversial point. President Nixon avoided the constitutional mess of Trump versus United States, doing us all a favor and resigning. President Ford pardoned him. Should President Biden have pardoned President Trump? It's a very interesting question. Those of you who are very angry at President Trump are shaking your heads, but think about it. It would have driven him nuts.
That is an excellent point.
He would not have been a victim. His political fortunes changed the minute the special counsel was appointed. We would not have had Trump versus the United States. If President Trump were reelected for some other reason, those guardrails would still be there. So this stuff isn't easy, politically or legally. I think our country's gotten a lot of mess because prosecutors and people at the Justice Department who are lawyers, not politicians, have made some really big mistakes, well-intended ones, they would say. And we all just need to do a better job. And I will cede the floor.
Thank you, Joshua. So we heard two contrasting accounts there, whether or not what we're seeing today is new or whether or not it actually has a history and quite a bit of precedence. One thing I think we can conclude is that it is producing a great deal of the very thing that Lisa warned us about, cynicism. Let me give you an example with three statements from students. One says, the rule of law is the principle that no one, no matter their status, is above the law. Trump has been found guilty of 34 felonies, been found civilly liable of sexual assault, is named thousands of times in the Epstein files, yet still remains the highest sitting office, in the highest sitting office of the land. What does that say about the rule of law in America? Where does that leave us? Another student says, there has been no congressional declaration of war since 1942. Well, in that case, what accountability will there be for our involvement with Israel's attacks on Palestine's infrastructure and its citizens? And another student question says, have the recent Supreme Court decisions, Trump v. USA, that we've heard referenced so often, deteriorated the Constitution to a point of irreversible damage? Take those together, and I think you get a sense of something that is quite prevalent among young people. We know it exists, and that is cynicism and pessimism and a belief that this system, whatever it is damaged beyond repair. We have just a few minutes left. I would like to invite Lorraine or Joshua to weigh in on this question, especially about what young people might do and where they should turn to now.
I totally understand the cynicism. And I have to say, and I don't want to be a skunk in the garden party, but there are not a lot of young people in this room. And I find that really sad. So I'm hoping they're in their other classes or, having a great time, but it does kind of make me wonder, like we're here at a university, where are they? I will say this. I think that there's been a lot of shock and awe coming out of the executive branch especially, and it kind of overwhelms you. I live in Washington. This has been my life for 40 years, and I'm canceling my subscription to the Washington Post. Like, it's just shocking to me. I've had it since college, but I'm like, other than the obituaries, I really don't read anything. So I am so encouraged, and I have to go back to this. I'm so encouraged about the young people who are working on these presidential campaigns, on whoever's presidential campaign. They work hard, they learn, they experience things, and I will always tell you, I'll never hire someone who only has Hill experience. Never. If they haven't had the curiosity, the interest, at least to go on a campaign, take a leave, go on a campaign, come back, whatever. There's just something about it when you're involved in the whole process that really can help inspire you. And so I would say to young people, though they're not in this room, I would just encourage you to stay involved, to try to the best of your ability to knock out the BS, because there is so much of it. I say this to my kids and my husband, stop listening. Because yes, we're gonna, there's so much drama and exaggeration and things that are never gonna happen. So stop listening to that. You can't let it affect you. And I would also say, get out of your bubble. I see this with my children, what they listen to, what they read. Like, you need to expand your horizons. You need to listen to someone who disagrees with you politically. You need to read some things that people that disagree with you or take a different view. It's not scary. It's actually very enlightening, and which you all know. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's just been what's been rattling around in my head.
Thank you for that, Lorraine. Everybody, we are at time. We must conclude, but this conversation, I hope, will continue these coming days and beyond. Thank you so much, and please give a round of applause to our wonderful panelists. Thank you all. Appreciate that.